Hamas barred.
That's what Hamas did. And Hamas say they didn't do it, but Hamas lied.
You contradict what America's report, you contradict Israel's report.
The Liberation Organization died. The children, they will rise up tomorrow and fight for liberty.
Biggest conversations from around the world. Borderlines with Ireti Bakare-Yusuf. Fridays at 4 p.m. Let's talk.
And it's a good afternoon again, Lagos, Nigeria. Yes, Israel, London, Britain, wherever you're joining us from. A lot of you join us from the abroad, as we say in Nigeria. Welcome to Borderlines, the only show that takes you beyond borders. So today we're going to my old home, the place where I grew up. Yes, I have with me a special guest, and I've been wanting to talk to him. It's not every day I get to talk to a British ambassador, albeit former, but never mind. And he's also a sir, not the kind of sir that we get in churches in Nigeria, but, you know, the kind of sir that's awarded by the Queen. Sir Richard Dalton is the former British ambassador to Iran. Sir Richard, welcome.
Thank you.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Is this your first time on Nigerian radio or Nigerian media at all?
It's the second time.
Oh, okay, great. So it's a pleasure to have you.
I'm very glad to have the honor to speak to your audience.
Oh, fabulous. We have a lot to cover because we need to know what's going on, really. Let's go back. Are you Cambridge or Oxford? Before we go further.
I studied at Magdalen College, Cambridge.
So you're a pale blue as opposed to a dark blue, right?
Well, I was never a sporting hero. I was only a plain student doing my history degree.
Okay. So how did you, well, because often you have Oxford people, they end up in the Foreign Service, and Cambridge in the other. So how did you end up in the Foreign Service?
Well, I think you'll find that the Foreign Service has people from all kinds of universities in Britain.
Right.
I ended up there because of my family's tradition of public service in the United Kingdom and my desire to live and work abroad, to understand foreign cultures and peoples, and to make a contribution to my country through its foreign relations.
Fabulous. Let's get right down to it. So let's talk about colonization first, because Britain colonized about 105 colonies. It was a period of rule and plunder. Many argued that Great Britain would not be great if it hadn't plundered. Would you agree to that statement?
Certainly, Britain extracted wealth, but it also contributed development. It also contributed ideas, democracy, whether the borders were the right ones, and it was a competition between many imperial nations, I appreciate that. But the foundations for modern nations and for modern progress were laid during that period.
So tell us, what was the historical context of Britain's involvement in the Middle East, and how do you think it's shaped the region?
It's shaped it for good and also for ill. For good in the relationship it had with the Arabian Gulf countries, for example, helping ensure they were independent in the period before they could stand on their own feet. Unhelpful in the promise made to the Jews of the United Kingdom and the world in 1917 by our Foreign Secretary, Lord Balfour, during the First World War, that there would be a national home for Jews in Palestine, and at the same time, the rights of the indigenous population should be respected. Unfortunately, we were unable to fulfill both parts of that promise. With the history of the interwar period and of the persecutions of Jews in the Second World War, it became the twice promised land, promised to Arabs for independence and promised to Jews for their home, and conflict ensued. So certainly the situation in Palestine I regard as unfinished business for Britain. And that has been said by many British politicians in previous periods. Unfortunately, at present, it's not seen that way by our current government.
It's interesting, and I'm glad you mentioned Lord Balfour. Would you say, given that Palestinian was a land that was, if you like, multicultural, multi-religious, before Balfour's Declaration of 1917, would you say, or what, no, let me go back. What would you say Palestine would be like today if Lord Balfour hadn't interfered, if you like, in the formation, in the culture of the land called Palestine?
It's very hard to do that kind of what-if exercise because facts are facts as established in history. For example, if the Ottoman Empire hadn't been defeated in the First World War, the chances of multiculturalism would have been much stronger than they have been in the former Palestine of the Mandate era and the Ottoman era since the end of the First World War. There would undoubtedly have been a massive impulse to emigrate to safe territory in Palestine in accordance with high Zionist ideals because of the persecution and the killings and the slaughter of the Holocaust and the desire of so many to find a better and more secure life for themselves once the Second World War ended. So there certainly would have been much more of a mixing of peoples. The key development, of course, that led to where we are today was not the Balfour Declaration. It was the Nakba, the war that resulted in the creation of the State of Israel within its internationally recognized borders, and which was ethnically cleansed by Zionist action, by Palestinians fleeing, and led to the creation of these refugee populations all over the Middle East, particularly, of course, in Gaza as the origin of today's conflict. But that war was the decisive point. So the question that I would put back to anybody who wants to try and do these counterfactual exercises is, was that war inevitable if a massive Jewish immigration clashed with the national aspirations of the population of Palestinians? And maybe the answer to that question should be yes. A war, a conflict would have been inevitable if those two peoples in large numbers clashed over their basic interests.
Indeed. Let's talk about the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal crisis of 1956 impacted British relations with the Middle East. What were the long-term consequences of that, in your opinion?
In the fortunes of the post-war British Empire, which was, of course, starting to be dismantled with the independence of India in 1948 and of Ghana in 1956 in particular, but the failure of the misconceived Suez Adventure in 1956 was a further milestone in the collapse of British imperial reach. We overreached then, as did the French and the Israelis who accompanied us in that invasion. And we were put firmly in our place by the United States, who threatened to withdraw investment in Britain and the financing of our vast post-war debt if we didn't withdraw our troops. So on that occasion, I think the Americans were probably on the right side of history.
So
More widely,
go on.
more
Yeah.
widely, of course, it didn't impact on Arab affairs beyond reinforcing the trend that was already present, namely of assertion of nationalist feelings, of the view that the neo-colonial influences of foreign powers in the Middle East should be repelled in favor of indigenous development and 100% control of national territories by rulers from within those countries. So hence the moves to drive out foreign military bases, for example.
So Britain does that, and then we have, decades later, the Iran-Iraq war. How would you assess Britain's, playing in his involvement in that Iran-Iraq war and its effect on the region's balance of power?
Well, the Iran-Iraq war was an attempt by Iraq to assert its national interests against what it saw as a severely weakened Iran after the revolution of 1979. And we all know that Saddam Hussein miscalculated. Western powers were largely neutral in that awful war, which led to such suffering on both sides. There was some arms supply to the Iraqi side. How decisive that was, I'm not clear. It was significant. It came particularly from the French. And the turn of the battles was occasioned by the sheer scale of the infantry forces which the Iranians could bring to bear against Iraq. I think that the eventual outcome after 4 years of fighting, negotiated by the United Nations with the support of the international community, basically returned both sides to the starting point, obviously deeply suspicious of each other, but both the Iraqi and the Iranian regimes survived, and the spillover effects, for example, the tanker war, the attacks on shipping in the Gulf, were largely contained, fortunately.
Let's talk about your time in Iran, because Iran, the Iranian society, is one of those where the majority of the world has never visited. We read about it. Some would argue that it's demonized. Some would argue that the demonization is correct. We don't know a great deal about it. I remember growing up in Britain, and all I ever heard was Ayatollah Khomeini and how, he's brutal and this and that. And I was that child that was afraid of, the Iranian society. But of course, having grown up, I'm much wiser and my politics is much broader. How long were you in Iran for, and how would you describe the Iranian society to those of us who have never visited?
Gosh, that's a very big question for a country of over 80 million people, how to sum that up in a few sentences, but I'll try. I was there for 3.5 years, from 2002 to 2006, during the period of the invasion of Iraq by the United States with British support, which lent tremendous tension to our first year and a half of my job as an ambassador. Iranian society is tremendously welcoming to foreigners. They're interested. They wish contact with the outside world. There's a huge Iranian diaspora. They know a great deal about foreign countries and not isolated in that sense. And the majority of the Iranian people don't share the narrow view of their rulers that strict interpretation of Islamic rules under the Shia tradition as interpreted by Ayatollah Khomeini in his idiosyncratic way, should be the determining force for how people live their own lives and how the state is organized. So the majority want the kind of freedoms which other societies take for granted. They want to be able to choose their rulers. They want representation that reflects who they are. And the majority is Persian speaking, but there are substantial non-Persian speaking groups within society who all identify themselves as Iranian, of course, but there's an Arab, Kurdish, Turkish, and of course, as a result of the disturbances in Afghanistan, now a very significant Afghan refugee population. There's also a Baluch sympathizing community of Sunni Muslims in the southeast of the country. So they want the opportunity to be more themselves rather than being forced into the mold of political and social organization determined by the Ayatollahs. I mean, to shift the focus to short-term politics, there's no chance of an early counter-revolution in Iran because there's no leadership, there's no organization. There's those who wish to reform the way Iran is organized in a more liberal fashion, but within the structure of divinely ordained rule interpreted by a supreme leader who is the person who has authority, as they think, under the dispensations of God. So there are reformists, but they have been sidelined, and the people who run the government now, representing, I believe, a minority in the country, do have very firm control over the security forces, and they are able, as in so many other societies, tragically, to use means of repression to silence those who raise difficult questions, who want to encourage a different way of organizing and greater freedoms. So although you can never be sure, because the situation does become volatile from time to time, it doesn't look as though the Iranians should be expecting change in their own circumstances in the short or medium term.
Would that be because Iran is a theocratic democracy? Because there are Christians in Iran, but they don't seem to get an option, if you like. I don't know whether they vote. Do they get to vote as Iranians? And is a theocratic democracy actually, how do you say, is it a form of another right-wing extremist democracy? Or would you say it's more sort of nuanced to the country, to the people, and their history?
It's certainly nuanced. That's one way of putting it. Ayatollah Khomeini in the 70s developed this theory, which is not shared by other Shia leaders, sources of emulation. The Maraja of Iraq, for example, don't agree with the theory of the Wali al-Faqih, the person who can interpret the will of God and who also wields secular authority. But the main question is, can a theocracy survive, and can it ever be reformed, or has it got to be swept away? And my suspicion is that, rather like communism, there are no half measures. You can't be a liberal communist state, and I don't think you can be a liberal theocratic state either. If what is important to you as a ruler is the elements of the Iranian constitution that point to divine inspiration as the source of authority and guidance, then you cannot admit that the democratic elements of the Iranian constitution under which certain rulers and legislators can be chosen by vote, you can't allow that to get out of control. And the result is that the democratic elements of the Iranian constitution have always been dominated by the system under which candidatures for elected office, whether regionally or in the parliament or in the body that, for example, chooses the supreme leader and is supposed to supervise him, those candidatures are approved by people who are not elected and who are largely appointed by the supreme leader. So naturally enough, they choose people in their own image and exclude even right-wing conservative figures in Iran who don't share the brand of right-wingness and conservatism of the supreme leader and those in his immediate circle.
I saw an interview with you on Radio Times in the UK where I am going to paraphrase now, where you said something about Iran is not ready for war. This was immediately after Iran sent all those missiles to Israel, okay? And Israel responded, and they were both playing, if you like, pussyfooting with each other. Everybody's sort of trying to avoid confrontation. Would you still stand by that Iran is not ready for war or is not capable of war? And why do you say that, given that we are constantly bombarded with the news that, and of course, Netanyahu has constantly said Iran has nuclear weapons, Iran is developing nuclear weapons and all of that?
Iran does not have nuclear weapons and is not developing nuclear weapons. And not war because of the impact of the arms embargo against Iran since 1979. They have a effective, inventive, diverse domestic arms industry, but they're always playing catch up, and their potential enemies are always a few steps ahead because they have access to modern technologies sold to them by United States largely, and also by Germany, and to a smaller extent by other suppliers. So if you think that the potential adversaries of Iran are Israel backed by the United States, and it's highly unlikely that Israel would wish to wage a war without an assurance that the United States would come in alongside them. So if you're looking at the panoply of weapons that that combination could deploy against Iran, then it's clear that the prudent choice of an Iranian ruler is maybe to go to the brink in a confrontation, but not to go over the edge and provoke an all-out interstate war, because they would lose. Above all, their air defenses are slight. They have no third-generation fighters. Their aircraft would be knocked out of the sky extremely quickly. Their navy does not have all the advanced capabilities necessary nowadays to defend against modern anti-ship weapons. They have a tank force, but again, aren't able to deploy the full defensive means required to deal with anti-tank weaponry from their potential enemies. So a set-piece war involving all those traditional arms is not something that Iran is going to risk at present.
Yet we constantly hear from Iran and everybody that Iran is leading the axis of resistance. How then is it able to do that if it literally doesn't even have the capabilities to fight the resistance? Or to fight for resistance, if you like. Yeah.
Iran's policy of protecting its territory from potential aggression by the United States, Israel, and maybe others, including possibly at some point in the future their traditional enemy, Iraq. They also have to allow for hostility from the Gulf Arabs, who are very much allied to the United States and are getting closer to Israel. So they see themselves as living in a potentially dangerous world. And their principal means of deterrence, given their limitations in conventional weaponry, is not non-conventional weaponry like nuclear weapons. It's arming and supporting armed groups within states, particularly to their west, Syria, Lebanon, to some extent Yemen, where there is already conflict and where they wish, the Iranians wish, to support one side rather than the other. And above all, they have armed Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Hezbollah has control of a massive missile force, which could make very serious difficulties for Israel, despite the Iron Dome defense system, in the event of a decision by the United States or Israel to go to war with Iran. So forward defense, fighting a war if they have to, that's not on their territory, is their first strategic response to the threat environment in which they live.
Now, let's talk about Iran and Israel. Could there ever, for as long as Israel is occupying Palestine, as the colonizer or the colonizing nation, if you like, would the, if you like, normalizing of relations between Iran and Israel continue to depend on Israel exiting Palestine? Or could Iran actually change its policy to be a peacemaker between both parties? Or am I being too optimistic and naive and wanting utopian? That's the word.
I think under the current leadership in Tehran, there's no chance whatsoever of Iran accepting formally the existence of the State of Israel and conducting normal diplomatic relations with them. They have, particularly the supreme leader, grown up, the leadership in Iran, grown up with the sense that Israel is an illegitimate state, and that the answer to the conflict in Palestine that's gone on for the last 100 years is a referendum in which all Palestinians, wherever they're located, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, West Bank, Jerusalem, Gaza, that those Palestinians and all Israelis should answer a question in a referendum as to what kind of a state they want to live in, 2 states, 1 state, or whatever, and that they, Iran, would be bound by the result of any such referendum. Now, Iran is alone in thinking that a referendum of that kind might ever take place. It's a totally unrealistic policy, as is the view of the supreme leader that Israel is an illegitimate state. Now, at different points in the past, other leadership figures in Iran have floated the idea that Iran could be brought in the context of a just settlement to accept whatever the Palestinians accept as the future of Israel and Palestine. So, 2003, a very important initiative by Iran, which was discarded without debate or consideration by the United States, they said as much. They sought to negotiate their differences with the United States, and that initiative went nowhere. Now, I believe that policy position, that something that was acceptable to the Palestinians would ultimately be acceptable to Iran, remains latent in Iran. I can't see Iran refusing to accept a settlement which was supported by Palestinians and indeed by the rest of the world. They would live with it. They would remain intensely cool to Israel under the current Iranian leadership. But of course, the current Iranian leadership may not be with us forever. although there's a good chance of a succession by a supreme leader to Ayatollah Khamenei in the not too distant future, and of the maintenance of the current structure of power, I am hoping that the new people who would come in then would be more flexible and more creative and could revive that idea from 2003 of a more hopeful policy on the Arab-Israeli conflict.
However, you just said that the US literally dismissed it. So why is the US the thwarter in all of this? Is it not so much the weakest link, but the spoiler in who continues to play lip service to the two-state solution whilst not actually investing in the possibilities and the factors that could actually create a proper and actual realistic two-state solution?
Well, I'll step back a moment and say that I believe the Middle East is the scene of the wreckage of bad United States policies. And as a British diplomat trying to further British interests wherever I was posted, one of the principal obstacles to the success of the kind of policies which I wish to see in the region was indeed the United States, where with its invasion of Iraq, its support for one side in the Yemen civil war, its total failure to hold Israel accountable for its many, many abuses, and its taking of the Israeli part in so many of the negotiations that failed after 1993 to establish a two-state solution under the Oslo process. So I'm no fan of what the United States has been doing over all these years. And that comes back to the deplorable state of domestic politics in the United States, where money talks and where so much money is attached to the idea of an undying support for whatever the Israeli government of the day asks for. But to turn to where we are now, it is indeed equally deplorable that the United States fails to exert influence on Israel to accept that it has done sufficient damage to declare a success for its war in Gaza, to stop fighting and get its hostages back. That is a viable policy option. The United States consistently prefers, alongside Israel, further destruction in Gaza and further defeat of the remaining Hamas fighters to an early end to this appalling war.
It's a good time for us to talk about, the likes of ISIS and Al Qaeda and how they've affected British foreign policy in the region. How would you say, such extremist groups, terrorist group like ISIS, Al Qaeda, ISIS was literally, you didn't have to go to Syria to feel terrorized by ISIS. The beheadings, which the videos and the propaganda was right in front of you. How would you say they've affected or shaped British foreign policy in the Middle East?
I think Britain is right to be part of the coalition of countries seeking to extirpate ISIS. It brings nothing but destruction to the people of the region. It defies the kind of values which we wish to see prevail in the region. So it has not, the fight against extremist Islamic terrorism is a fundamental of British, European, American foreign policy and the foreign policy of many other countries. And I think it's going to remain so long as a substantial threat to countries with which we wish to have a constructive relationship continues. And that would include Iraq, potentially Syria, once its civil war can be wound down. It also includes Yemen, again, once that civil war can be wound down. And of course, allied countries like the United States, which remains threatened by ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
Would you say ISIS has it literally been shrunk to powerless, or is it still really active? We just don't get to hear about them anymore because there are other conflicts that are dominating the media.
Other conflicts are dominating in the media, but there are still attacks mounted by the rump of ISIS in the parts of Syria and Iraq, which are hard for the forces of those countries to control. At the moment, they are contained. I don't think there's a likelihood of the kind of takeover based on collapse of the armed forces of either Syria or Iraq. So the chance of ISIS achieving its aim of a caliphate across those parts of the Middle East, I think, are very, very low. But if you look at the analysis by people who trace this much more closely than I do, you'll find that the concern they have of the potential of ISIS for violence has not gone away. And sadly, we see it in Africa, local groups using Islamic ideologies as a cohesive force to try to establish control in limited areas of African countries. So I think vigilance is going to be required for a long period ahead in many states.
I have many, the lines are going. You can call. We've only got 20 odd minutes left with Sir Richard, 2770993. But you can send your WhatsApp questions on WhatsApp to 0809597585. Also send to our Facebook and our YouTube because we are streaming live, and we will go there to pick up your questions. Sir Richard, before I go to the lines, my final question for now is about westernization. Let's talk about the concept of westernization. More and more African countries, the continent as a whole, is pushing back on westernization. Right now, we have the G7 going on, with world leaders, or shall I say, so-called world leaders, who only account for 2% of the world population. What's that all about? And why, the likes of South Africa are sort of invited as observers rather than participatory. What's going on? Why should we continue to trust westernization, given that the days of Great Britain is over, the days of colonization is over, the days of being British subjects are over, and actually we are coming into the space where the more and more campaign for an emancipated Africa or global South. What would you say? Why should we continue to accept westernization?
Well, I don't think you should. You should choose whatever route to fulfillment of the ambitions of your people seems best to you. But I would hope, particularly in the case of Commonwealth countries, that you would be influenced in your choice by the principles which you have adhered to internationally, not just in the Harare Declaration, but also in the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and so on and so forth. But it's that universal desire for improvement, but at the same time, human rights, that should guide all countries rather than any specific concept of how to do that. And I think the days when diplomats or others from Europe talked in terms of westernization are long gone. I mean, the debate that I think you're alluding to goes back to the very earliest days of liberation from colonial rule. The idea that there was formal independence in the capital cities of Africa and elsewhere, but that there was such a thing as neocolonialism, whether through investments or influence, which limited the choices and tried to re-exert control. So I think that debate is a debate that has been had for 60, 70 years, and it's time to put it behind us and say nobody should be seeking to follow automatically anybody's model, whether it's in the old days it was a communist model or a Western model. Nowadays, maybe there's strong influence from China because they've got so much money to invest. But we shouldn't be talking in terms of following a Chinese model or a French model or an American model. It's for countries to determine what they wish to do themselves in consultation with their own people.
Indeed. You can call back because I didn't want to interrupt Sir Richard as he was talking. Whoever you were, you can call back. And there we go. State your name. Remember the rule, your name, where you are calling from, and your question, please, in about 30 seconds. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, good afternoon. What's your name and where you're calling from, please?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Speak louder, please.
You have to fill up on the line.
Go ahead.
First of all, my question to Sir Richard is, number one, he spoke about how America has mismanaged the Arab-Israeli crisis over the years. Right now, America is going into an election in another 4 or 5 months now. Plus or minus, if we had a Donald Trump, what does he think is going to happen to the already brokered, peace we had in Oslo, 1993 is talked about, and the new accord introduced by, Donald Trump in 2017. That's one. Number two question mark. Iran. He said Iran is important. Yeah, Iran is important. Right now, China has been able to broker peace between Saudi and Iran. Today, they are part of BRICS. And the North and the South dichotomy, global North and global South dichotomy, is a very serious issue of contention. Does he think bringing Iran into the peace talk is not going to help? I think bringing Iran is going to help the matter in Palestine.
Okay.
And that aside, how is that going to be to impact the dichotomy between the global North and the global South, given China and Russia?
So what's your question? The lines are going. What's your question, please, on that second one?
My question is, what if you bring Iran into the matter, doesn't he think that the problem is going to be resolved?
Okay,
That,
thank you.
The counter-interest of global South and global North.
Thank you.
Again, thank you.
Thank you. So, Richard, if you could write that down, the lines are going crazy. The first part of his question was to do with Donald Trump and U.S. foreign policy and the peace process. And, of course, the step he took in moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. I'm just going to answer 2 more calls and then you can respond to them. Hello?
Hello.
Yes.
How are you? My name is Sam.
Sam, go ahead. Where are you calling from?
From Moe.
Okay, your question, please, Sam.
Okay. Is it possible for all countries that are involved to leave both Israel and this thing alone and let them solve their problem?
Okay. Israel and Palestine. Mm-hmm.
Yes, America is supporting one side, Iran and some Arab nations are supporting the other side.
Okay.
Is it possible for us to allow these people to settle? They are brothers, so
okay.
They are all children of Abraham.
Yes, I hear that. Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much. And the last one I'm going to take. Hello. Hello.
Hello. Good afternoon, Sisi Oget.
Good afternoon. What's your name and where you're calling from, please?
Yeah, I'm Raphael from Ikorodu.
Raphael, go ahead with your question, please.
Yeah, your guests have been very, very good in analyzing the situation in the Middle East between from 1947 downward to today. My question is that I think the UK government is an accomplice between 1918 to that 1947, because there's one General Allenby who led the war during the First World War. He led that territory on a very sorry state and very untidy. So
so what's the question?
Yes, I said the UK is an accomplice with America.
So you are asking, is the UK an accomplice with America in the genocide that's going on? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, there you go, Sir Richard. So you have I think probably one of the most interesting ones you can probably answer first is, why doesn't everybody leave Palestine and Israel to sort out their problems? Because you've got the U.S. interference on the U.S. backing Israel, and then you've got Iran backing Palestine, and never the twain shall meet. What if both of them stepped out? That's what one of my callers was asking. Would things be better?
Sadly, no. And that's because Israel was created through a resolution of the United Nations, and the rights of the Palestinians have been confirmed repeatedly in the United Nations, including in the Security Council. The fundamental principles for solving this problem were set down as early as 1967 in the famous Resolution 242 and later 338. That still guides the idea of a two-state solution. And the sides have shown year after year after year that they are unable to solve this problem on their own.
Okay.
So it was right for countries to try and get involved in the early 1990s in a diplomacy that led to a promising initiative to resolve the question. And it remains unfinished business that the ideas that we all supported then have not been put into practice. And the tragedy, of course, in the world is that in some conflicts, we do leave people to fight it out amongst themselves. Think the awful suffering of Nigerians over the conflict over Biafra. Think of the 5 million displaced people and the innumerable deaths in Sudan in 2024. But our inability to deal with all the problems of the world doesn't absolve us from the duty to do our best to support those trying to find a solution in Israel and Palestine.
Okay, let's go to Donald Trump, because we've only got a few minutes left. Donald Trump and U.S. foreign policy. If Donald Trump was to win, what would happen with this genocidal war?
I don't think there'd be much difference, because Biden has shown himself to be weak, vacillating, unable to defend his own red lines. He said that he wouldn't supply arms to Israel in the event of a major invasion of Rafah in southern Gaza. He's now sending out his diplomats to say, oh, doesn't matter that 1.3 million people have been displaced and that scores and hundreds are being killed in Rafah. This is not a major operation. So, of course, we can go and continue supplying weapons. The United States' credibility is shot to pieces.
Okay.
And there's no doubt that Trump would be even more of a friend of Israel. It's one of his big selling points, his abandonment of principle by recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights and over East Jerusalem was a betrayal of the fundamental principles of international law. And he would do more bad things, I've no doubt about it.
So I think, I didn't write down the third question. I don't know whether you have it.
About Britain being an accomplice.
Yes, correct. That's right.
The third questioner asked whether there was a parallel with British behavior in the interwar period. He mentioned General Allenby. I I'm afraid I do regard Britain as complicit in Israel's crimes in Gaza, because we have not supported the International Court of Justice. We've not supported the International Criminal Court. We have not revealed our own legal advice as to why we think it's right to continue to supply small quantities of arms to Israel. We bleat from the sidelines and basically support the American position that the most important thing is that Hamas should be totally destroyed. And we don't consider that the methods Israel is using is illegitimate. And I fundamentally disagree, along, I believe, with the majority of the British population, with the policy of our government on this matter up till now. We have a general election in 3 weeks' time. There's a slight hope that a new government would change policy, but I'm not expecting much.
Absolutely. Right. I've got 2 questions that I want to try and fit in before we run out of this 5 minutes. Number one, which I did want us to talk about, was the growing right-wing extremist in Europe, especially now, more worryingly for you, for me, for those of us who have family in the UK, with the likes of Nigel Farage, okay, and Reform, etc., etc. And it would also seem like the Conservative Party are borrowing from that, as well as the Labour Party. What do you have to, you're smiling, what do you have to say to that? Should we really be worried? I mean, I'm going to give you like a minute because I have one more question.
No, I don't think you should be seriously worried. The structure of British law on racism, on discrimination, will stay in place. Our judges will ensure that even if there were a right-wing government at some point in the future, we would remain a civilized society, in my opinion. I don't believe that there's danger of contagion from the more extreme right-wing parties of the continent of Europe into Reform or even the Conservative Party. What has been driving the rise of Reform is 2 things. First, the growth of legal as well as illegal immigration into the United Kingdom, which strains social cohesion in country after country across the world. And it also does that in Britain. And secondly, the disaster of Conservative government over the last 14 years and the disillusion of Conservative voters. They feel they can't vote for a party they've never considered voting for in the past, like Liberal Democrats or the Greens or the Labour Party. And so they flirt with the idea of protest voting for Reform. But it's possible that Reform, although it has a considerable following and many people may vote for it, it may only have a tiny or even no actual representation in Parliament because of the way our political system works. So there's no need to be too worried about it.
Okay, superb. I have one question from Facebook, and my last question is, do you think that the world has finally reached its limit of tolerance with Israel during this genocidal war where we've had some 38,000 Palestinian kills, over 80,000 injured? Has the world had enough of Israel and its excuses and reasons, whether valid or invalid, whether, that's not discounting what Hamas did on 7/10, but Israel's response to that. Has the world had enough of Israel?
World governments have not had enough of Israel. That's the tragedy. There's this total dissociation between what very large numbers of the citizens are thinking and feeling about Israel and the actions and policies adopted by governments. And it could be that this will be a turning point and that in future Israel is going to be held accountable. But so long as the United States stands 100% behind Israel, whatever its government does. The rest of us who want to see peace and justice and human rights should not be optimistic. We should be pessimistic.
Now, I have a question from Facebook, which is Britain still, so I guess this will be my last question because I'm being told time is up. Is Britain still giving money to Nigeria? Aid? And in what form?
No.
You don't know?
I don't know. I hope not.
Why'd you say that?
I mean, small sums for technical cooperation, police cooperation, security training, counter-Islamic activity. Yes, please, let's have that kind of cooperation. But I don't think we should be in the business of a major capital grant aid program to Nigeria. Sir
Richard Dalton, we will be calling you again. Please do say yes to our invitation. Thank you so, so much for being on Borderlines in Nigeria, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All the best. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
.3 Nigeria Info. We are more than just radio. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Nigeria Info FM. Check us out on Facebook at Nigeria Info 99.3. Follow us on Twitter at Nigeria Info FM and on Instagram at Nigeria Info FM Lagos for live updates as it happens. 99.3 Nigeria Info. Let's talk.